I think the assessment was that Donald Trump would try and do some things to appeal to the middle of the electorate, to appeal to suburban college-educated women. He's not. I mean, basically, we have a psychopath running for president. I mean, he meets the clinical definition, okay?
Wait a minute.
Hillary Clinton,
wait a minute.
Yeah.
Do you really think diagnosing people on air, and I assume you don't have a degree in psychology. Is that fair? I mean, we're jumping.
Let me tell you something that most news coverage buries under layers of political noise.
We're jumping to conclusions here. I think this is what gets voters a little frustrated with this campaign.
Listen, the grandiose notion of self-worth, pathological lying, lack of empathy and remorse. So my point. So here's, I think he does, right? I don't have a degree in psychology, but here's, Chuck, basically the race sits today. I think Hillary Clinton is guaranteed at least 269 electoral votes. Think about that. Because Virginia and Colorado, both campaigns, I think, believe are put away.
Some of the most alarming things ever said about Donald Trump didn't come from his enemies. They didn't come from protest signs or opposition ads.
Come to you in the response from Congressman Ruben Gallego getting a lot of attention this morning.
Yeah, it's a response overnight to the president's most recent comment about the FBI. Here is the congressman's tweet. He said, "You are such a psychopath," to President Trump, "that you have to make even the death of 17 children about you. America will regret the day you were ever born." Look, I think what he's doing here is he's going down to Trump's level with name calling. And I think a lot of people who see this tweet react to it by saying, do you have to stoop that low?
They came from the people who sat across the table from him, worked alongside him, and in one case, literally put words in his mouth. The man who wrote the book that launched Trump's entire public image has been sounding the alarm for years. A legendary news producer just walked away from a 4-decade career rather than keep working under conditions he could no longer accept. And a former Obama campaign manager went on national television and said something that stopped the host mid-sentence. What you're about to hear isn't punditry. It's testimony from insiders. And once you understand the full pattern, it becomes very difficult to look away. We're starting with Tony Schwartz, and if you don't know this name, you absolutely should. Schwartz is the ghostwriter behind The Art of the Deal, the 1987 bestseller that essentially invented the myth of Donald Trump as a business genius. That book didn't just sell millions of copies. It built the foundation of Trump's public persona, the larger-than-life dealmaker image that eventually carried him all the way to the White House. Without that book, there might not have been a Trump presidency. So when the man who wrote that book starts publicly calling Trump a psychopath, that's not something you can just scroll past. Schwartz didn't write that book from a distance. He wasn't working from press releases or secondhand interviews. He spent months inside Trump's world, watching him run meetings, negotiate deals, interact with staff, handle conflict, and relate to the people around him. He had the kind of sustained, unfiltered access that no journalist, no political opponent, no television host ever got during that period. What he saw up close led him to conclusions he's been sharing publicly ever since, through media appearances, interviews, and statements that have only grown more urgent over time. He went on MSNBC and said flat out that anything goes for Trump when it comes to behavior and ethics. He called Trump a psychopath based on specific, repeated patterns of behavior he personally witnessed. And here's the part that hits different in hindsight. Schwartz publicly warned years ago that Trump might refuse to accept an election loss and refuse to leave office. Think about when he said that. Think about what happened in 2020. That wasn't a lucky guess. That was an informed prediction from someone who understood exactly who he was dealing with. Now, ghostwriters don't typically do this. The entire professional model depends on discretion. You spend intimate time with the subject. You write their story in their voice, and then you move on. Quietly, professionally, preserving the relationship because your future career depends on your reputation for loyalty. Breaking that norm publicly, repeatedly, and on the record is not something a serious writer does casually. The fact that Schwartz has been doing it for years, consistently, without walking it back, tells you everything about how seriously he takes what he observed during those months inside Trump's orbit. But Schwartz isn't operating in isolation here. He's one piece of a much larger pattern, and the pattern is what makes this impossible to dismiss. By the way, please leave your questions or comments in the comments section. I will answer each one individually as time permits. Also, I would be very happy if you liked the video and subscribed to my channel. Now, let's continue. Back in 2016, David Plouffe, the man who managed Barack Obama's 2008 presidential campaign, sat down on Meet the Press and said something that made the host pump the brakes almost immediately. Plouffe looked into the camera and said, "Basically, we have a psychopath running for president." He wasn't being loose with the language either. He pointed to specific characteristics, the grandiosity, the pathological dishonesty, the complete absence of empathy, and argued that Trump fit what he called the clinical definition. The host pushed back right away, asking if Plouffe really thought it was appropriate to diagnose someone on air. Plouffe acknowledged he wasn't a psychiatrist, but he didn't back down from the substance. What makes that moment so striking now is the timing. Plouffe said this in 2016, before Trump had held office for a single day, before the chaos of the first term, before January 6th, before the classified documents, before the attempts to overturn state election results. Before all of it, he was essentially making a prediction based on observable behavioral patterns, and everything that followed has confirmed rather than contradicted his read. That's not partisan spin after the fact. That's assessment that held up across years of real-world evidence. And then there's John Kelly. This is the one that really should land hard for anyone who thinks the insider criticism is just sore losers with book deals. Kelly is a retired Marine Corps 4-star general. He served as Secretary of Homeland Security before becoming Trump's chief of staff. This is not a political operator with an axe to grind. This is a man who built his entire identity around service, discipline, and institutional loyalty. And he still walked away from Trump's White House and started publicly describing the president he had served as dangerous and unfit. When someone like John Kelly uses those words, they don't use them lightly. They use them because they believe them. James Mattis did the same thing. Former defense secretary, former Marine general, universally respected across party lines as one of the most serious national security figures in modern American history. After leaving the Trump administration, Mattis expressed deep concerns about Trump's judgment, particularly around crisis decision-making and his relationship with democratic institutions. Again, this is not a career politician settling scores. This is a man whose entire reputation was built on sober, careful, nonpartisan judgment, and he felt compelled to speak out anyway. The list goes on. Former national security advisors, former cabinet members across multiple departments, former senior officials who came into the Trump orbit with real professional credibility and left it with serious public warnings. The sheer volume of this insider condemnation is itself the story. In American political history, it is genuinely unusual for this many former top-level officials to publicly describe a sitting or former president as unfit for office. It's not normal. It doesn't happen with every administration. It happened with this one repeatedly, from people with nothing obvious to gain and significant professional risk to absorb. The mental health professional community has also been navigating this terrain carefully. There's a long-standing professional principle, sometimes called the Goldwater Rule, that restricts psychiatrists from diagnosing public figures they haven't personally evaluated. Most professionals have respected that boundary, but groups of mental health experts have still found ways to sound alarms through open letters, public statements, and professional publications describing patterns consistent with malignant narcissism and gross unfitness for leadership. They're being careful with their language precisely because they take their professional ethics seriously. But the fact that they feel compelled to say anything at all, given those constraints, is itself meaningful. Now let's talk about Bill Owens and the 60 Minutes situation, because this one hits differently. It's not about words someone said in an interview, it's about an institution. Owens spent nearly 4 decades as executive producer of 60 Minutes at CBS. 4 decades. That's not a job, that's a legacy. Under his leadership, 60 Minutes remained one of the most respected investigative journalism programs in American broadcasting, a show with a reputation built over generations for asking hard questions of powerful people regardless of party or politics. When Owens resigned in 2025, he didn't just quietly slip away. He said publicly that he had lost the independence to run the show the way he had always run it. Read that again. After nearly 40 years, he said he could no longer do his job with the independence that job requires. His departure came in the middle of an ongoing legal assault by Trump on CBS, a $10 billion lawsuit over the editing of a Kamala Harris interview during the 2024 campaign. $10 billion. That is not a symbolic figure. That's not political theater dressed up in legal language. That is a damage claim large enough to threaten the financial survival of an entire media company if it were to succeed. And whether or not the underlying editing complaint has any merit, the effect of that lawsuit on how journalists inside CBS approach their work is not hard to imagine. This is how institutional pressure works. It doesn't always need to win in court. It just needs to make the cost of aggressive journalism feel high enough that editors and producers start making different calculations, quietly, internally, in ways that never make headlines, but absolutely shape what stories get told and how they get told. When Owens says he lost his independence, he's describing exactly that process from the inside. And when a 38-year veteran of one of America's most important news programs resigns over it, that's not a personnel story. That's a press freedom story. The ripple effects go far beyond CBS. Every newsroom in America is watching. Every editor and executive producer is taking notes on what happens to outlets that push hard on this administration and what happens to the ones that don't. The chilling effect is real, it's measurable, and it's already shaping coverage in ways most Americans never get to see directly. Now, to be fair, and I want to be genuinely fair here, there are legitimate counter-arguments that deserve honest engagement. Critics of this entire framing will point out that words like psychopath get weaponized in political fights in ways that strip them of clinical meaning. They'll argue that former insiders sometimes have personal incentives, book deals, media profiles, political alignments that color how they frame their public statements. They'll note that legal action over specific editorial decisions isn't automatically the same as a broad assault on press freedom. They'll push back on mental health professionals commenting publicly on someone they've never evaluated. These are not crazy points. They deserve acknowledgement. But here's what the counter-arguments can't fully explain away: the convergence. The fact that people coming from completely different professional backgrounds, a ghostwriter, a campaign manager, military generals, cabinet secretaries, mental health professionals, a broadcast journalist, are all arriving at similar conclusions through completely separate paths. Tony Schwartz wasn't coordinating with John Kelly. David Plouffe wasn't workshopping his talking points with James Mattis. Bill Owens wasn't part of any political operation. These are independent observers with radically different life experiences and professional frameworks, and they've been pointing in the same direction for years. That convergence is not easy to explain away as partisan motivation or personal incentive, and the predictive accuracy matters enormously here. Schwartz warned about election refusal before it happened. Plouffe's 2016 assessment was essentially confirmed by everything that followed. The concerns about press freedom that critics raised years ago are now being lived out in real time by one of America's most iconic newsrooms. When warnings from credible insiders turn out to be accurate predictions rather than overblown hysteria, that tells you something important about the quality of the underlying observations. So here's where we land. What you've just heard isn't a collection of political attacks from partisan adversaries. It's a consistent body of testimony from people who actually saw what they're describing, from inside boardrooms, inside the West Wing, inside broadcast news, inside the professional worlds where Trump has operated across his career. The man who wrote the book that made him famous says he's a psychopath. The general who served as his chief of staff says he's dangerous. The producer who ran 60 Minutes for 4 decades says the pressure became too much to keep doing the job honestly. That's not noise. That's signal. And the question every American has to sit with is a simple one. At what point do we decide that the volume and credibility of insider warnings is something our democracy has to take seriously? Not after the fact, but in real time, while there's still something meaningful to be done about it. The ghostwriter is still talking. The question is whether we're actually listening.